Hello, everyone. The North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance is pleased to welcome you to our first Watershed Wednesday webinar of the fall season. We've been running these once a month on Wednesdays throughout the fall and winter and have had a variety of great guest speakers discussing exciting local projects, research, and initiatives happening in our watershed and beyond. These webinars provide the opportunity for you to learn something new and ask some questions over your lunch hour. Today's topic is bison in Alberta, the ecology and conservation of a keystone species. We're joined by David Bruinsma and Wes Olsen as they share their insight and expertise gained from extensive experience working with this fascinating species. Following the two presentations, Wes and David will answer the questions from the audience. Feel free to add your questions into the chat box throughout the webinar and we will address them during the question period. So our first speaker today is Wes. He'll start off with the ecological role of bison. So after working for more than 40 years with this charismatic animal, Wes has developed an international reputation for his knowledge about both plains and wood bison. Wes has the unique ability to combine his extensive scientific knowledge about bison with his talents using graphite, watercolor, oil painting, and mixed medium artwork to capture the buffalo and other wildlife in their natural environments. Olsen brings to light a few of these fascinating relationships and explores the keystone role that bison continue to play wherever they are found. All right, so I will stop sharing and allow Wes to take it away.
Oh, pardon me, I got the wrong one up. One moment.
All good. Have a few little tech buggy issues today, but it's always how webinars go.
There, am I shared now? Can you see my screen?
I still see that you're on slide 40, but yeah, I think, did you press the presentation mode? Here, let's see. We had it before, so we'll be able to get it. There we go, looks good. And then, perfect.
Excellent.
Looks good.
Well, thank you, Julian, for the invitation to be here today. The book that we wrote, The Ecological Buffalo on the Trail of a Keystone Species, is about 150 pages long, and I've tried to summarize that into 15 minutes of presentation time. So this is the first time I've done it, so hopefully it'll go with no glitches. So the talk is the ecological buffalo, and it refers to the keystone role that they played and do play historically and today. For those who might not be familiar with it, I suspect most are. The keystone is the stone at the top of a stone arch that holds the arch or the structure together. If you pull that keystone arch out, the arch will obviously collapse. Can you see the white text at the bottom of the screen?
No, we can't. Or yes, we can, sorry. To remove the keystone species.
Just have to move. All right, so you pull that stone out and the arch will collapse. And the same is with ecosystems. If you pull a keystone species out of the arch, the system will collapse. So this is all about bison, of course, since that's my specialty. Bison grazing on the grasslands of North America create a pretty heterogeneous ecosystem. Without bison grazing on the landscape will still be complex, but it'll be a grass-dominated landscape, similar to this illustration where there's no forbs, no flowering plants in this ecosystem. This was the case in Grasslands National Park from its establishment in 1981 through to the arrival of bison there in 2006. It was a grass-dominated landscape. Once we brought the bison back onto that landscape, we began to see a change in the vegetation structure with an increase in the number of forbs or flowering plants. This plant is the winter fat, named that because cattle gain fat on it during the winter months. So it's still a complex ecosystem, but it's getting more complex as species like the Nuttall's cottontail begin to move into the ecosystem. There's a continued change in the above ground and below ground root structures and plant species diversity. And over time in grasslands, it's become an incredibly rich and complex ecosystem with forbs and flowering plants and insects and 13-line ground squirrels. And this is the goal of having bison back on the landscape, is to make it as complex as this illustration demonstrates. There's a neat study done in the desert Southwest where they looked at the diet of rattlesnakes. They went to museums across the Great Plains and looking for pickled snakes so that they could dissect them and see what food they were eating. And in grasslands, we put radio collars on bison like this cow and follow their movements over time. And they would travel on average probably 10 to 15 kilometers in a day. So she's grazing, she's ingesting seeds from the plants that she's eating. She'll move off however many kilometers she walks that day. And typically they'll lay down in bed like this, have a nap, chew their cud, and get up and leave a little deposit on the landscape. Well, that dung is loaded with the seeds that she ate 15 kilometers away. And this eventually broken down by dung beetles. Here's a pair of Canthon pilularis wrestling over a brood ball. That brood ball contains seeds that were in the larger bison patty, and they'll disperse that brood ball away from the pat and into the vegetation around it. And in doing so, that brood ball will eventually, the seeds in it will eventually germinate and produce a new plant miles and miles away from where the host plant was. Species like the northern or the Board's kangaroo rat or other pocket mice will forage across the landscape, in this case harvesting Indian ricegrass seeds. They have a large fur-lined pouch in their cheeks, and they'll stash that full of dozens or perhaps hundreds of seeds. Well, if they don't make it home in time, if a rattlesnake manages to snag that Board's kangaroo rat or a pocket mouse, the rattlesnake also ingests everything that's in that cheek pouch. Some research has shown that on average, a rattlesnake will consume between 12 and 20 pocket mice per day, or per summer, pardon me. And as the snake moves across the prairie, it's slowly digesting the pocket mice, and it excretes the undigested material farmed from the capture point. Snakes lack the ability to digest vegetative matter, seeds, for example, and some of those seeds actually germinate inside the colon of the snake. And as the snake moves across the prairie, it's leaving behind a perfectly fertilized, fully germinated seed as it deposits those seeds in its travels. Those seeds later germinate, and perhaps hundreds of kilometers away from where the original plant was hosted, species like the northern or the pronghorn antelope will ingest that same plant, and it will in turn will disperse more seeds across the prairie. As an aspen parkland environment, some of the ecosystem interspecies connections that exist here in Elk Island National Park. Here's an example of a bull that's bedded along a little grassy meadow. Bison tend to graze these upland slopes and then move back to the forest edge to graze or to ruminate, chew their cud, and like on the Great Plains, they get up and leave a buffalo patty behind. Many years ago, I was working in the park as a park warden, and I saw this woman crawling around in a grassland on her hands and knees, very intently focused on something right below her nose. I couldn't stand it, and I had to walk over and ask her what she was up to. And she was a woman from Finland doing her PhD on the slave-making behavior of one ant species on another. And when she did that, she realized that virtually every anthill in the park is created on a buffalo patty, and the queens will search those out and establish a new colony. So because bison deposit the majority of their dung pats adjacent to the forest edge rather than out in the middle, there's a higher density of anthills adjacent to the forest edge than there is out in the middle of the ecosystem. And that's important for these guys, the northern flicker. Northern flickers will create their nest cavities adjacent to the forest edge because they like to hop out on the ground and eat ground insects. And in particular, they really like to eat ants. And that's important for these guys, the northern flying squirrel. The northern flying squirrel can typically only use its flicker nests. It's the Goldilocks of nest cavities in diameter and size. Smaller woodpeckers create a cavity that's too small, and larger ones like the pileated, they're too large. So these guys are fussy on how they use these nesting cavities. They use some as refugias, places where they can escape to a goshawk perhaps, or an owl is flying through the forest. They have others that they use just for rearing their young, natal cavities. And they have others that they use exclusively for their defecation, like toilet cavities. And that's important for this little guy. He's an inconspicuous, only 4 to 11 millimeter long dung beetle. The only place on the planet that you'll find it is in flying squirrel dung in these nesting cavities. So if you didn't have plains bison in that sequence of events, very likely you'd have a lower population of flying squirrels and, as a result, a lower population of those tiny dung beetles. Bison wallows are one of the favorite places that my wife and I travel to. And there's far more that meets the eye when you're looking at a wallow like this one in Grasslands National Park. This is in Yellowstone National Park. A pair of pronghorns are foraging on the vegetation that surrounds the rim of a wallow, because when bison wallow, they push the topsoil to the sides, creating a deeper and more friendly environment for grasses to grow in. This is in land between the lakes, wildlife sanctuary in Tennessee, turkeys that are foraging on seeds around the outside of a bison wallow. And across the Great Plains historically, there were tens of millions of spade-footed toads that used flooded bison wallows as part of their reproductive cycle. The spadefoot toad has the fastest metamorphosis of any toad on the planet, from egg-laying to fully morphed adult in a bison wallow that's flooded is only 10 days. So remarkable at adaptation to flooded bison wallows. And of course, there's a whole host of species. In some wallows, we've counted over a dozen species that use the dusty bison wallow for cleaning their feathers in birds or having a dust bath with other small mammals. Other ungulates will bed in there. And historically, this is in grasslands again, there are literally thousands of ancient bison wallows. And all these depressional areas in the middle of that photograph are ancient bison wallows that have probably been used historically for hundreds, if not thousands of years in some cases. And they have a completely different vegetation mix, mosaic, within the wallow than on the unwallowed grassland adjacent to it. And this is recent work that's just being done right now. Fellows looking at the use and abundance of wasps in bison wallows. Josh Klosterman is doing this research, and he's found over 80 species of bees and wasp nests in bison wallows in the Konza Prairie of Kansas, or pardon me, the Nachucha grasslands. He's also found 30 species of kleptoparasitic wasps and flies. So you can imagine what it was like having that biodiversity just from one bison wallow moving up the food chain to all the insectivores that would have preyed on them. This is brand new research. I wish I'd known about this before we wrote our book. So I whipped right through that. That is the book, The Ecological Buffalo. So I'll pass it on to David now.
Perfect. Thank you, Wes. That was very fascinating. It's interesting to see how much of an impact bison have on our landscapes. And I'll just encourage everyone to remember to add some questions you might have into the chat, and we'll address those at the end. So here we go, just sharing this. So David Bruinsma has been on the research conservation team at Elk Island National Park since 2019. He has coordinated the park's bison management. Perfect. But there we go. Bison management program since 2022. He is passionate about continuing Elk Island's important role in bison conservation, especially through transfers of surplus bison from the park to other conservation projects and to Indigenous communities. In addition to the bison program, Dave spends much of the spring and summer months focused on monitoring Elk Island songbirds and species at risk, including bats and western toads. He has a background in avian ecology and species at risk, having worked elsewhere in Western Canada on boreal and grassland songbird monitoring and recovery of burrowing owls and ferruginous hawks. Dave holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Studies and a Master's degree in Natural Resource Management. He lives in Edmonton with his wife, 2 sons, a dog, and 2 guinea pigs. Perfect. So I'll pull up those slides here. And yeah, take it away, David. Thanks for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Jillian. And yeah, I apologize for the technical difficulty we have here. I don't have Zoom installed on my computer, and so screen sharing was a little bumpy this morning, so Jillian's going to be flipping through my slides on her end instead. So I'll at the end of each one, I'll tell her when to switch. But thanks for joining. And yeah, as Jillian mentioned, I've been at Elk Island for close to 6 years now. And more of my work has started to focus on the bison program in the park. And that's what I'm going to speak to you about today. So let's move on to the first slide. I do feel like I have big shoes to fill because I'm not quite the same position, but similar role to what Wes did in Elk Island for decades before I came here. So I definitely have a lot to learn from him, but it's great to be collaborating on the same webinar today. I do have a land acknowledgement in my presentation as well, which I'll read. I think it's especially important when we're talking about bison or buffalo, as many Indigenous people prefer to call them, given how culturally important they are to many Indigenous peoples. So I acknowledge that the land that this work pertains to is on Treaty 6 territory, which is the home of many Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Stapi or Blackfoot, the Métis, and Nakota Sioux. I acknowledge the generations of Indigenous people who have stewarded this land throughout time and who continue to do so. I recognize that we are all treaty people and have a responsibility to work towards reconciliation, reconnection, and shared stewardship. Next slide. So just a quick overview of what I want to talk about today. I'm just going to talk about sort of the overview of bison management and conservation at Elk Island, and then some of what we do for our bison handling practices at the park, including the facility that we have for doing so, and then talk about some of the bison transfers that we've done with surplus animals out of Elk Island and some of the work we plan to do with that program going on into the future. Next slide. So I don't know, I didn't get a chance to look at the chat there of where people are dialing in from. But for those of you who have not been to Elk Island, it's about a 30-minute drive east of Edmonton on Highway 16 on the Yellowhead east of the city. The park started in around 1906 in just sort of the north block around the Ostoten Lake area as a preserve for elk, one of the last free-roaming wild elk herds in the area at the time. And it's since expanded to its full size of what it is today, which has a block north of the highway and a block south of the highway. And this map is a bit misleading because the red lines are not all, the perimeter is fenced, and some of the interior lines are the zones that were added in different years. But the main thing to know is that the perimeter of the entire park is fenced, as well as the highway 16 going between the north block and the south block is fenced, so that the area south of the highway and north of the highway are two completely distinct geographic sections of the park. And you can move to the next slide. So we do have two subspecies of bison at Elk Island, and I am not nearly as talented an artist as Wes is, so these are my little doodles on the screen there to help differentiate wood bison from plains bison a little bit. I won't go over all of it, but one of the main differences you can tell is in the hump shape of the bison. So on the plains bison, which is on the left side of the screen, the hump is a lot more sort of a rounded sort of hill shape, with the highest point equal with or behind the line of the front leg. Whereas on the wood bison on the right-hand side, the hump is a bit more of a steeper cliff shape, and the highest point on that hump is forward of the front leg, sort of more closer to their head. There's some difference in their fur or their pelage as well, whereas the plains bison has a more fluffy sort of bonnet of hair on the top of its head and a more filled out rounded beard. And also the cape and chaps, which are the fur on its back and its sort of front shoulders, tends to be a bit more clearly differentiated from the shorter hair on its hindquarters. Whereas on the wood bison, the hair on the head is a bit more droopy, kind of straight. The beard is a little bit more scraggly and less defined, and the cape and shoulder hair, the cape and chaps on the shoulder and legs are a little bit less defined and kind of blend more gradually into the shorter hair on the hindquarters. Wood bison are also generally about 15 to 20% larger than plains bison. And historically, they would have ranged in the northern parts of North America, in the boreal and maybe coming as far south as the Aspen Parkland, but more sort of boreal and north, whereas the Plains bison would have been in the prairies and south. In Elk Island, we have anywhere from around 475 to 700 Plains bison in the north part of the park, so north of Highway 16, and about 300 to 500 wood bison in the south block of the park, south of Highway 16. And I'll get into why those numbers are such a wide range in just a minute. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the entire park is fenced. So that fence is as close to bison-proof as we can possibly make it. They rarely, if ever, get out of the park, and that's because it's sort of an unacceptable risk for the private landowners around us. They don't want bison walking onto their acreage or trampling or eating their crops. We also don't want to pose a safety risk for people using the highway and the county roads surrounding the park, because if you hit a bison at 110 kilometers per hour on Highway 16, that's probably a dead bison, as well as some pretty serious injuries or fatalities for the people involved in the crash as well. So we do have to keep the bison within the park. We also do it for their own safety, not just for preventing vehicle collisions, but also we don't want disease exposure to livestock diseases that they could be exposed to outside of the park, and potentially even interbreeding. If a bison had been out of the park long enough, they can hybridize with cattle, or they can hybridize with the other subspecies of bison. And so we want to prevent that from happening as well. We do also have large numbers of elk and moose and deer in the park. The fence is large. It's not as quite a hard and fast barrier for them. Moose, as you can see on the photos on the right there, can kind of get over it. It's an awkward situation, and they usually end up pulling the staples out of the fencing and taking some of the fence down, but they can get over the fence if they're really motivated. Elk as well can sometimes get over or jump it. And deer, the fence is very permeable too, because they can get under low spots in the fence and where the gates are and jump places. So the deer come and go from the park. The elk and moose mostly are contained by it, and the bison are fully contained. And any animal smaller than a deer can either get under the fence or over it or through it. And so it's not really a barrier to the smaller wildlife. Next slide. The thing about having a fenced park and large herds of grazing animals is that there is a lot of grazing pressure on the vegetation that we have in the park. Our bison herds increase by anywhere from around 15 to 25% per year. I think the average is around 18% per year increase. So you can imagine that if we didn't do anything to manage that population and reduce their numbers periodically, we would be up to our ears in starving bison pretty quickly. The maps on the center and left of the screen there, center and right of the screen, show on the middle map the land cover classes within the park. And I really want to point out that yellow, which is the grassland, and that sort of lavender light purple, which is some of the wetlands. And the bison really heavily graze those yellow colored grassland areas on the map, especially in the summer. And in the winter, when it's frozen, they really heavily graze in those wetland margins around the water bodies, where there's a lot of sedge vegetation that retains its protein better in the winter. And so they kind of target that in the winter season as well. They can access it better in the winter because the ground is frozen and they won't be getting their hooves stuck in the muck the way they would if they tried to eat that in the summer. On the right of the screen is a map of our bison GPS collar data. So we have a number of adult female bison that spend most of their time with the larger cow-calf herds in the park. And you can see those dark green areas line up almost perfectly with the larger blocks of that yellow grassland and lavender wetland area on the map. So most of our bison spend most of their time in a very limited part of the park, simply because of habitat preference and forage availability. So they really are hammering, as much as the park is fairly small, they're really hammering the vegetation in a very small part of it and spending their time in a very small part of it. Next slide, please. And so in order to see how much our bison population has grown each year, park staff conduct an aerial survey where we charter a helicopter to fly back and forth across the park. We do transects that are, I think, 500 meters apart, and we're looking 250 meters out from the helicopter on either side. So we get full coverage of the park with this and do a census. Where there's some of the larger herds and it's too difficult to count them live from the helicopter, we'll take photographs and enumerate them that way afterwards. Once we have the total for our annual count, we can compare that to the previous year's count and see how much the population has grown and what we need to reduce it by in order to prevent hyperabundance in the park. Next slide, please. So we do remove wood bison and plains bison biennially in alternating years, meaning that one year we handle and remove plains bison, the next year we handle and remove wood bison, and so on and so forth. So we handle bison every year, alternating between the subspecies. Which animals we remove in terms of the number and the ages and sexes that we remove from the park is designed to mimic predation and minimize the loss of genetic diversity and to create a natural demographic structure within the herd that remains in the park. This means that we remove a lot more young calves and yearlings and old, which is what predators would be doing if we had, say, a large wolf pack that was capable of depredating bison. They would preferentially be taking the younger animals because they're smaller and easier to kill, or the older, weaker animals that might be sick. And this also helps to maintain genetic diversity. If we keep the breeding aged animals in the park and remove the young and old, we actually retain the most sort of genes in the gene pool, which is important for our herds because they're relatively small and can be susceptible to inbreeding. One of the recommendations from Parks Canada bison ecologist who did his PhD work on genetics of bison in Elk Island is that we should not remove more than 30% of the herd in any one year, just so that we're not losing too much of the genes from the population at any one time. So we have sort of a genetic minimum viable population size, that's the MVP, that we want to keep it above, and we also don't want to remove more than 30% of the total of any one subspecies in any one year. Next slide, please. So we do need to handle the bison prior to removing them from the park. And the reason for this is that throughout most of Alberta, with the exception of a few newly identified areas in the northern boreal area, bison outside of national parks don't have a class. They're not classified legally as wildlife, and they're considered as livestock. So even if we're sending them to a place where they're going to be released as wildlife, while they're in transport, they're still considered to be livestock, and so we do need to put ear tags in them. And in order to ear tag them, we need to handle them. By getting up close to ear tag them, it also provides us with the opportunity to weigh and age them, to check them for pregnancy, to collect samples for research, to perform disease testing, to put GPS collars on a few animals that we release back into the park, and to sort the ones we're removing into their precise load groups for when we put them on a truck and trailer to send them elsewhere. Next slide, please. One difference between handling bison, or I guess some of the differences between handling bison and cattle, and even between handling bison at Elk Island and bison on a privately owned bison ranch, is that the bison in Elk Island are wild. And I know they seem very, accessible. You can see them from the highway. You can drive to the park and see them easily. But the ones that we handle are the ones that we remove from the park. And so all the ones that are left over have never gone through this. And so each year when we handle bison, we're dealing with an entirely naive batch of animals who have never gone through this before. Whereas domestic cattle have had tens of thousands of years of selective breeding for many features like meat production and milk production, but also for docility towards humans. Bison have not had that. And bison on a privately owned ranch don't have that 10,000 years of domestication in them, but they, as individuals, will have gone through handling in the past. And so they're kind of more familiar with what's going on. Whereas when we put a bison through our handling facility, it's the first time they've ever had this happen to them. As a result, we have to be very careful to use low stress handling techniques that are particular to bison and differ from cattle in a number of ways. And I'll talk about some of that. That could be a whole presentation on its own. I could speak for hours about the things that we've done to tweak our facility to make it work better for bison, but we don't have time for all that today, but I'll touch on a bit of it when we go over the handling facility. Next slide, please. So speaking of the handling facility, the map on the right-hand side is the overview map of our entire sort of pastures and pen system. The whole thing is designed to, in as low a stress a way as possible, get an animal that strongly prefers to be in open areas in a herd to be by itself indoors where we can get an ear tag on it. And getting it indoors in what we call the squeeze, which I'll show you in a little bit, is probably the least natural thing for a bison in the world. And so we really do have to be careful to do it in a way that is as humane as possible, considering the natural nature of bison. The map in the left-hand sort of center of the slide there is a zoomed in part of our handling facility that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So we begin our handling process. We do it in the winter when it's cold out because bison will be more attracted to bait hay that we put in the pastures and pens compared to in the summer. They've got lots of fresh green grass in the park and they won't be very motivated to come into a fenced area. Whereas if we put out hay and we have water bowls that are heated, open water and hay is much easier for them nutritionally in the winter than what they have to scrape through the snow to get on their own. So usually we start the handling process in January when it's cold, put that bait hay out in those pastures and pens and start baiting herds in and closing the gates behind them. We spend about 6 to 8 weeks sorting them into their demographic classes. So by the time we're actually ready to put them in the squeeze and handle them, we want to have a pen that's been sorted into calves, a pen that's been sorted into male yearlings, female yearlings, breeding-aged cows, breeding-aged bulls, old bulls, etc. And we do this as passively as possible by putting bait hay in adjacent pens, waiting for them to self-sort, and then coming in later that afternoon or the next morning and shutting the gate so that we don't have to chase them around very much. At a certain point, we got to do some splits on the ground with the tractor and people on foot, but we try to do it as passively as possible. Next slide, please. So when we get to that sort of 6 weeks in, once we've sorted them into their demographic classes, we're now at a point where we start running animals through the facility itself into the squeeze so we can work on them up close. We do that in what we call our daily handling area. You can go to the next slide, where we'll bring in a group of around, say, 10 or a dozen animals into the daily handling area that has a holding pen and a splitting pen. We've got some folks that are very well trained to work with bison on the ground that will pressure that small group towards the bottom end, I guess the back end of that holding pen. And then as they start getting a little bit squirrely and not liking as people approach, one of them will run and squirt around the side, and then the handlers will back pressure off to keep the remaining group in the back and let that first one that started leaving squirt behind them around the side of the pen, and then through a gate that we have an operator on who will close it behind them. And that single animal has now been split from that medium-sized group. Sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 animals slip by, and that's fine. We've got areas further down the line where we can split them. The point here is that we can only take one animal in the squeeze at a time, and so by the time they get there, we have to have them split down into individuals. Next, Ben, please. So the next section of the facility they move through is we call the back alley. There's a bunch of different gates along this path. So as I said, if we had 2 or 3 or 4 sneak through out of daily handling, we have opportunities to split them in the back alley. If they get a split of 1 out of the daily handling pen, we'll just leave all those gates wide open and it can just move its way through without stopping. Next slide, please. The next section of the handling facility we call the single chutes. This is an area where it's the path the bison takes narrows into sort of a chute that's 1 bison width wide, and we've got some sliding gates that create stalls that are roughly 1 bison length long. It used to be that we would load up these single chutes. I think there's 12 different of these single chute stalls, and we load them up with bison so that we'd always have one ready to go in the squeeze for working on. But we found that having a bison in an enclosed space like that by itself for long periods got them really stressed out. They'd often balk, which is sort of like stalling and refusing to go any further. It would actually slow operations down because every time you stop a bison, it's a lot of work to get it going again. And it wasn't good for the animals either. They can be susceptible to something called capture myopathy, where if they get really stressed, they can overheat to a point where their temperature and lactic acid buildup from stress can cause protein denaturation in their body, and it can cause organ damage and paralysis and even death if it goes to extreme levels. So we've really kind of gotten away from holding bison in stages and trying to have a continuous flow where the process for each individual is as short as possible through the system. Next slide. So after their one is in the single chutes, we'll move it into the squeeze building. I'll get into some details there. Once we've actually processed it in the squeeze and ear tagged it and collected any samples that we're going to collect, There's then a sorting tub. When we release it from the squeeze building, we'll have radioed ahead to the sorting tub operator to tell them which gate to open. They'll have that gate set, so when the animal is released, it will be put into the pen that we want it to be for its load group, so that when we remove it from the park, it's already in the group of animals that's going to be going in the same truck altogether, and we don't have to do any subsequent handling to split them into their transfer groups. Next slide, please. So this is inside that squeeze building itself. The squeeze is a big hydraulic machine. It's got a crash gate with some shock absorption, so when they come in, if they're going a little fast, it's got some give and they don't injure themselves when they come into it. It then has a hydraulically operated neck extender that kind of catches behind their horns and pulls their head forward so they can't move side to side. They have a little bit of up and down movement, but it really prevents their head from being able to swing. And then we also, once it's secured in the neck extender, raise the crash gate and then put a blindfold on them, because the blindfold helps to calm them down as well. Next slide, please. So again, in that squeeze, we can get up close and work on them to put ear tags in and put GPS collars on them if we're doing that for a few that are going back to the park. Next slide, please. And this also gives us an opportunity to age them. You can get a sense of age by looking at size and body shape and horn formation, but for a more precise age, we can also look at their teeth. There's different dental developments as they age. At a certain point, they have their full set of adult teeth, and then it's just looking at wear and tear on the adult set, but we can get a better sense of age by getting up close and doing that. And we can do things like take blood samples or tail hair samples or fecal samples while they're sort of physically immobilized in that squeeze. Next slide. So once they've all been sorted into their load groups after the handling is done, we can move them from the pen they're in around the outer ring of the facility into the loading chute. The loading chute, this basically works the same as it would on a cattle operation, where a cattle liner or a stock trailer is backed up to the end of the loading chute, and we can move the bison from their pen onto that chute, and from there onto the truck, and from there out of the park to their new home. Next slide, please. So once we have a transfer group all sorted and on a truck, there's a variety of places we might send them. So we'll do transfers to other parks and bison conservation projects, transfers to Indigenous communities. We'll slaughter some for disease testing. I put less than 20% of the surplus. In recent years, it's probably been more like 10 or less than 10% that get killed for disease testing, just to make sure we don't have certain livestock diseases of concern in the population. We have done some transfers to zoos and universities, although that was more common in the past. And then if we have other bison that we need to remove from the park just to reduce our surplus population, but we don't have enough of the conservation projects or Indigenous communities that are ready to receive them, then the remainder we sell at auction to private producers. So bison ranchers can buy them, but it's usually kind of the dregs of the surplus. It'll be older individuals that are not as desired for breeding stock in new herds, often more males that will sell because the females are desired for breeding stock for other projects. So we often sell a lot of males, and that's our lowest priority. We just have to do it to get them out of the park so that we don't have so many mouths chewing on all our grass. I think these numbers they might be a year out of date, but over 3,400 bison, around over 2,000 plains bison and over 1,000 wood bison have been transferred from Elk Island to 115 different locations. Next slide, please. This is a map of the locations that bison from Elk Island have been transferred to over the years. The circle size is roughly proportional to the number of individuals that were transferred, and the yellow is plains bison and the black are wood bison. You'll notice there's a really big dot there at Buffalo and National Park, just to the southeast of the red X on the map. The red X is Elk Island, and that Buffalo National Park was a national park that used to exist near Wainwright. And a lot of Elk Island's bison were transferred there in the 1930s. And unfortunately, they were subsequently shipped from Buffalo National Park up to Wood Buffalo National Park in northern Alberta, which was quite a tragedy and, quite frankly, a mistake on the federal government's part, because it was plains bison that were diseased, that had become diseased with tuberculosis and brucellosis at Buffalo National Park. That got sent up into the wood bison habitat in Wood Buffalo National Park and has created quite a nightmare of a problem up there because they've hybridized with the wood bison and transmitted those diseases to the wood bison in that part of northern Alberta as well. But the bison that remain at Elk Island are the Plains bison, are the descendants of those, the original animals that came from Montana before they were sent to Buffalo National Park. So we still have disease-free Plains bison and wood bison at Elk Island. Next slide, please. And I think this one, unfortunately, because of the tech glitches, this was a little animation that somebody had made showing the sort of timeline and numbers of bison being moved from Elk Island to different sites around North America. But this isn't going to work because Jillian is presenting through PDF rather than PowerPoint. So we'll just have to skip this, but it basically shows that map that we saw earlier. Some of the bison transfers to parks and conservation projects that Elk Island has been involved with is to places like Grasslands National Park and also to Banff National Park. So most of our animals are removed on trucks like I showed, but in Banff, they were trucked part of the way, and then to actually get them into the backcountry, they had to airlift them by helicopter in specialized shipping trains to get them into the Panther Valley backcountry where there's no road access. And both populations in Grasslands and in Banff have done very well. I think Grasslands is up to 500 plus animals, and Banff is close to 150 animals. I think it's probably been about 22 years since Grasslands received bison from us, and it's been about 5 years since Banff received bison, and both herds are doing quite well. Next slide, please. We've also been transferring wood bison to Alaska. The first shipment went in 2008. They held them at a research facility in Fairbanks for 7 years, and in 2015 took the descendants of those 2008 bison and released them into the wilds in the remote parts of Alaska. And then more recently in 2022 and just this year in 2024, earlier this spring, we've transferred additional shipments of wood bison calves to Alaska. So I've been pretty heavily involved with that side of things, and I took the picture of that truck in the lower left there. We got to be a follow vehicle following the cattle liner out to Alaska. So it's pretty cool to be part of that and sort of see that through from trapping the calves in the pens at the beginning of January to seeing them actually get to Alaska in April. The photo of them in the pens, they have to have a 60-day quarantine period where we do some additional disease testing for the international transfer. So they had to hang out in the park in a pen for a little longer than we usually do. Next slide. I mentioned we also transfer quite a few bison to Indigenous communities, which has been super exciting to be a part of. It's been great to be able to give back, sort of have these bison herds that Elk Island has been stewarding for, in the case of Plains bison, over 100 years, and in the case of wood bison, 70, 75 years that we've had in the park, and now we're able to actually return those animals to their homelands, and that's been pretty cool to be a part of. And more of our transfers are increasingly to Indigenous communities. We're looking at anywhere from 4 to 8 different communities receiving Plains bison this coming winter. And it seems like more and more the word is getting out that Elk Island has surplus bison that we're excited to transfer to Indigenous communities, and we've gotten more and more requests. So we do our best to try and fulfill those. I think it used to be more transfers to zoos and universities for research, and we've been doing more of these conservation and Indigenous focused transfers as time has gone on. Next slide, please. This was also a little video that you can see the initial frame of it here, but won't work on the PDF version, but was just of a release of bison that were transferred from Elk Island to Onion Lake Cree Nation in 2021. Just of the truck actually opening the gates and letting them out of the truck onto their land, and the people filming and celebrating that release. Next slide. So coming up, as I mentioned, we hope to do more of these conservation transfers. We have a memorandum of agreement with Alaska to transfer more wood bison to them again in 2026 and in 2028. We're looking at potential transfers of wood bison to some of the at-risk wood bison herds in northern Alberta. And we have lots of requests for plains bison and wood bison from Indigenous communities that we'll do our best to fill. And then lastly, we're also looking at introducing genetic material from wood bison elsewhere into Elk Island's wood bison. And the reason for this is that Elk Island's wood bison founding population is very small and the genetic diversity is very low. And the reason we haven't done this yet is that most of the other wood bison populations out there have either come from Elk Island, and so they're already a smaller subset of our gene pool and don't add any genetic diversity to bring that back in. And anything like in Wood Buffalo National Park, where there's a lot more wood bison with greater genetic diversity, they have plains bison gene integration, as well as some of those cattle diseases that we don't want brought into Elk Island. So we haven't got to this point yet, but they're working on a lot of sort of cutting edge research about how we could get wood bison genes from wood bison in Wood Buffalo National Park into Elk Island without actually transferring diseased animals and the diseases themselves. So that's kind of the next thing we're working on for conservation. And that way, when we transfer wood bison out of the park, they'll be that much more genetically fit and able to adapt and do well in their new homes. I think that's my last slide, other than my contact information there. And I think that works out well in terms of leaving 10 minutes or so for questions for Wes and I. But, thanks for listening.
Excellent. Thank you. And yeah, we do have some questions in the chat. So I will just address those right now. Just adding some little spotlights here on everyone. So I think the first few were for Wes. One is, we'll see if you have an estimate here, but Shelley asks, what is the current buffalo population in Alberta?
I'll go a little broader scale first off. In North America right now, there's about between 400 and 450,000 plains bison. Most of those, of course, are in the US. I wrote down some numbers so I could give you accurate numbers. 1 second. In Canada, with our wood bison population, there's currently about 3,700 in conservation herds across primarily the north. In addition, there's about 750 plains bison in conservation herds in Canada. In Canada, there's about 190,000 bison on ranches and farms, and in the US, a lot more than that. Boils down to Alberta, I think there's only, well, those numbers I just gave you, 3,700 wood bison and 750 plains in Alberta.
Wow. Do you know what the population was historically for bison back when they were in full population?
Numbers, before the great genocide of bison, probably in the neighborhood of 300 million. That was reduced in a matter of 20 years down to 23 wild bison living in the headwaters of the Pelican River Valley in Yellowstone, and another 250 wood bison that survived in the very northwestern corner of Wood Buffalo. So we almost lost them. All of the plains bison in North America owe their origin to 109 wild-caught plains bison. So very close to extinction.
Oh, really puts it into perspective, and that makes me grateful to see all these initiatives happening to preserve the populations. So another question also for Wes, can you comment on the establishment of wild bison migratory corridors on public land and their impact on restoration of degraded industrial agricultural lands?
Complex question. There are very few corridors, if any, in Alberta right now, other than between populations in Wood Buffalo National Park. Otherwise, with wood bison, there are none. With plains bison, there's hope for the future, though. There's a movement underway right now to establish a transboundary, free-ranging plains bison herd between Montana and southern Alberta, up the east slopes of the Rockies from primarily the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana near Browning, and then up these slopes of Glacier National Park and into Waterton. The fences are being built as we speak, and there's about 160 bison waiting to begin that annual migration north and south up that corridor.
Wow. That would be really cool to see happen. Sorry,
yeah. Oh, if I can just add to that as well, that herd that's on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana is a fairly neat story as well. because it's quite close to the original herd that Canadian federal government purchased in the early 1900s and brought to Elk Island. And the Blackfeet Reservation got Plains bison from Elk Island. I believe it was 2017 or 18, 7 or 8 years ago. And so that herd literally returned to, the descendants of that herd literally returned to the place it came from, 120 years later or so, which was a pretty neat thing to be part of. And that's now going to be the herd that's potentially free roaming between Blackfeet and Waterton and Glacier National Park as well.
Oh, interesting. So next question we have is, considering how important buffalo are to grassland ecosystems, what kind of changes occur when the landscape is dominated by cattle instead?
Do you want me to take that one?
Sure, I think it's a little bit pertaining to your discussion with those interspecies.
Cattle were a surrogate for bison from the end of the extirpation period in the late 1800s, late 1880s, through to until about 1910. They did provide all of the services that Plains bison once did, with the exception of a few key things. Cattle don't wallow, so all of those ecosystem benefits or services that wallowing provided to the landscape didn't exist with cattle grazing. And bison have a much denser hair coat than cattle do. There was a study done in 1963 in Manyberries, Alberta, where they looked at the hair coat density of yearling Plains bison heifers, yearling Hereford heifers, and yearling yak. And some poor fool had the job of counting the number of hairs per square inch. With a Hereford, on average, it was 8,000 hairs per square inch. On a yak, about 12,000, and on a bison, just under 20,000 hairs per square inch. So when a bison sheds their hair, it comes off in large sheets or felts because it's so dense and lands on the landscape to be utilized by other species. Cattle shed hair in individual strands, so there's no benefit to nesting songbirds, for example. So while cattle can be surrogates in their grazing behavior if they're left to do it naturally, there's very few instances where that takes place today.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering that myself as well. So that's good to know. Another question asks, were the two breeds, the Wood and Plains, historically mixed?
The interpretation that I've read most often was based on a large-scale skull morphology survey done by a guy named Dr. Stan van Gilderdong in 1985. He collected every bison skull that he could find in Alberta, from Northwest Territories south to the U.S. border. And he did morphometric measurements on them and found that in a band about 100 kilometers wide along the North Saskatchewan River, there was a zone of overlap. So Plains bison would move north into the aspen parkland during the winter months to seek the shelter and food that was there. And wood bison would move, Plains bison would move north, and wood bison would move south. And they shared space and time in that roughly 100-kilometer wide band and created a hybrid between the two subspecies. That hybrid extended all the way into the Rocky Mountain chain and south to southern Grand Tetons National Park. And when Europeans were first encountering bison in the mountains, they referred to them as mountain bison because they looked and behaved completely differently than the Plains bison that, they'd seen tens of thousands of Plains bison. So I think that was a hybrid mountain bison, not a true subspecies, but an ecotype.
Oh, it's really interesting as well. We have another question, I think for David this time. So since you've been with Elk Island National Park, have you seen an increase in visitation? And has there been a need to increase awareness on not feeding wildlife, ensuring you're a safe distance away, don't pet the fluffy cows?
Yeah, I have a don't pet the fluffy cow sweater myself. Yes, I think especially kind of post-COVID visitation, it had been increasing for a while, and then post-COVID just shot up with people looking for outdoor recreational opportunities, and kind of I think we're a bit of a victim of our own success in terms of advertising the park and encouraging people to come. Visitation has really skyrocketed, and on the one hand, that's great because I think Elk Island provides sort of a gateway to folks in urban areas of Edmonton in Greater Edmonton that might not otherwise have a chance to see wildlife and kind of have an opportunity to get outdoors. On the other hand, it has placed a lot of strain on the ecosystem in the park. Also, staff resources in terms of sanitation and all the sorts of things that come with more people. I don't know that there's a lot more instances of people feeding wildlife, partly because we've been trying to be as proactive as possible to prevent that, where we have seen notable increases in the number of roadkill. Unfortunately, even including bison, and probably some of you maybe heard that on the news recently, that a number of bison were struck on the main Parkway Road in Elk Island a few weeks ago. It's just a tragedy that happens every so often. But even more so, there's regularly dozens and dozens of toads or salamanders or snakes, squirrels, songbirds, these sort of smaller things that get hit by the vehicles, partly just because there's more vehicles on the road, and also the nighttime visitation has increased because of the popularity of aurora watching. And Elk Island being in the Beaver Hills and the Dark Sky Preserve, it's become a popular spot to come out and watch the aurora, which there are now apps for that predict when it's going to be good. And on those nights, there's a lot of squish critters on the road. Not because anybody is doing anything wrong per se. If I'm doing field work at night, I've probably run over toads without realizing it as well. But just sort of as a numbers thing, that's gone up, and we are looking at some mitigation options there that aren't quite in place yet, but we do need to address that because it's getting a little worse for sure.
Okay.
And if I could just add to that, when I started work as a warden in Elk Island in 1984, our annual visitation was 160,000 people per year. To get that many on a long weekend now.
Yeah, I mean our annual visitation is probably close to 500,000 people per year, and we're regularly on nice weather weekends having to shut down the park because all the parking spaces are full. We literally can't fit any more vehicles in the park, and we also don't want vehicles backing up from the entrance gate where they have to get their entrance pass back to the highway and causing vehicle collisions on the highway. So we've had times where we've had to let vehicles in without paying and say, pay at the campground because we can't have vehicles waiting here anymore. Let vehicles in just to keep them from backing up to the highway. And then once everything is completely full, shut the gates and say, we're sorry, but there's physically isn't more parking space. We can't fit any more vehicles anymore. So it's great to see people enjoying the park, but it comes with its drawbacks for sure.
Yeah, it's difficult to balance that because it's nice to have, more people trying to enjoy nature and get out there, but I think a lot of parks are dealing with this right now. Yeah, so we're kind of almost at time, but there's so many great questions, so maybe we could ask a couple more. If you guys are all right with that. One was, how was bison migration? How was the bison migration path in early centuries in Canada? Sorry, I don't know if I read that correctly, but how has the bison migration path changed maybe since those early centuries?
I'll tackle that one. I didn't have it in the presentation, but if you look at a grassland ecosystem grazed by bison, bison create grazing patches or grazing lawns, areas where they intensely graze the vegetation and ignore the untouched vegetation around it. They do that because when that grassland, that little patch grows back up, it's incredibly nutritious, instantly digestible and highly nutritious. And it's that constant regrowth that drove bison ecology for thousands of years. Every animal in a population would try to find a previously grazed patch of grass and consume it. So that migrations during the summer months were historically thousands of smaller herds that would coalesce into massive herds. There's an example from Moose Jaw when they were surveying the US-Canada border, where the survey crew was trapped in their tent for 10 days while one herd of bison walked past. They had to even bring their horses into the tents to keep them from getting sucked off. So the Great Plains of North America could sustain those massive herds for the breeding season, which is typically the 15th of July to the 15th of August. And the 15th of August typically is a period of time when grasses cure and no longer produce new vegetation in those grazing lawns. So those massive herds couldn't continue to stay together. They'd have to fragment and disperse back across the landscape. The early literature says that the migration patterns were vast, that they would travel from Texas to northern Alberta, Because people had no way of figuring out where they were going. Today, most people assume that or think that bison have a dual dispersal pattern. Local populations historically would stay within a fairly small home range, and others would bounce from between home ranges as they sought food that might otherwise have been already consumed. So 2 dispersal patterns, but no long range migrations, I don't think.
There's been some, that same geneticist that I mentioned did his PhD work on bison genetics in Elk Island. He's been working with Parks Canada and some other agencies, and they have been doing an ancient DNA study where they've collected samples from bison from before European colonization and found doing lots of interesting stuff with that. But one of the things they found is that, at least with Plains bison, if I'm summarizing his results correctly, that there was a lot of mixing of sort of the continental population of Plains bison, and maybe not individuals traveling long distances from Texas to Alberta, but this herd would, come in contact with this herd and interbreed, and this herd would come into contact with this herd and interbreed. And so that over time, there actually was gene exchange from basically the northern part of the Plains bison range down to the southern part of the Plains bison range. Over long periods of time, there was exchange of genes that way, even if not individuals moving long distances.
And the 109 individuals that are the base population for all North American Plains bison, we got really, really lucky because those 109 animals came from coast to coast and from the U.S. border south, so broad geographic range. So we were very lucky that we captured a broad genetic sample of the pre-slaughter period. It's almost identical.
Yeah, so Elk Island is has the descendants of that population as well, and our Plains bison genetics are remarkably good, considering that it was the ones that were left behind in the park was about 60 to 80 before the rest got sent to that Buffalo National Park near Wainwright. The genetic diversity of the Plains bison is surprisingly, amazingly high, whereas for the wood bison in the park, they all came from 20 pregnant female wood bison that were brought from Wood Buffalo National Park after they'd realized sort of this mistake of shipping these diseased Plains bison up there. They caught some pregnant females that were in a pocket of the park that they didn't think had come in contact with the Plains bison and brought them to Elk Island and fenced them separately in the south block away from the Plains bison. And it turned out that those females actually did have brucellosis, and before they could pass it on to their calves, they separated the calves from their mothers and hand reared them and slaughtered the mothers. And so Elk Island's wood bison are the descendant from those 11 hand-reared calves. So the genetic diversity is quite low just because of the small size of that founding population.
Wow. That leads kind of into I think the last question, kind of pertaining to the same topic is, are there any wild plains or wood bison herds in Alberta or Canada that did not originate from Elk Island's herds?
Yeah, so Plains bison, there aren't really any free-roaming herds other than Banff, which is partially fenced and sort of heavily managed to keep them in the desired release zone. And anything that's close to a conservation herd, even if it's fenced, probably did come from Elk Island in Alberta. For wood bison, there's several populations in Wood Buffalo National Park and sort of surrounding areas that are original wild free-roaming wood bison, although they do have the integration of Plains bison genes and some of those cattle diseases as a result of those 6,000 or so that were moved from Buffalo National Park near Wainwright to Wood Buffalo National Park in northern Alberta. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, Wes. There are a few, I think, in the Northwest Territories as well that are sort of original free-roaming wood bison herds that were not from Elk Island.
Yes, it's the Mackenzie Bison Sanctuary. That population was established from the same source herd, the Yarling River or Needle Lake herd in Wood Buffalo in 1963, when they took 18 animals there and established the Mackenzie Sanctuary. And I think currently there's about 3,500 in that population.
Well, I feel like we could talk about this topic forever. It's super fascinating to learn about all the intricacies of bison. But I think, yeah, we're at time. Thank you guys so much for all your responses to these questions. It's been really interesting, fruitful discussion. So yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up. But yeah, thank you, Wes and David. And I will just quickly lead off the end of the webinar here. A little bit of a teaser for next time. So if you want to join us November 6th and December 4th, we have some really interesting topics coming your way. We've got Nicole Seitz-Vermeer from Alberta Agriculture discussing nutrient targets for small streams and Alberta agricultural watersheds. And then on December 4th, we have Ben Kissinger from FRI Research and Dr. Hui Jones with the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nations Wakamne Science and Culture Initiative. So discussing monitoring freshwater ecosystems in 2 different organizations. Should be pretty interesting, both of these webinars. So you can go ahead and register on Eventbrite. And yeah, you can also watch this webinar recorded on our YouTube channel coming up over the next week or so. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And yeah, to Wes and David for coming out and sharing all their knowledge. And hope to see you all next time.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thanks for organizing this. It's my pleasure.